This is a quick guide as to how to make the loops for the buttons for the traveller dress front. So I have cut some strips from the scraps after cutting all of the pattern pieces out on the bias. I don't think it's 100% necessary to cut on the bias. If you don't want to waste fabric, if you've got some scraps that are just on the straight grain, just cut them. It's going to work perfectly fine. I've cut 1 inch just because I was working with a quilting ruler, but it's about 2.5 centimetre strips, and you need enough to get the 6 loops for the front. So it's around about 40 centimetres. You can do 1 long strip, 2 strips, it doesn't matter, as long as you have enough to do those. So I'm just going to go ahead and put the right sides together, and I'm going to stitch about 5 millimeters from that folded edge, and then use the loop turner to pull it through. Now that you've stitched that sort of, just under 5 millimeter, you want them as fine as you can. I like to just trim back some of the seam allowance. It just makes it easier to turn using the loop turner. So I did a bit of trial and error with the lengths of these loops, and I think I've worked out that 6 centimeters is the best. 7 was too long. So I'm just going to cut 6 lots of 6 centimeters. Now, of course, depending on the size of your buttons, so I'm using a 12 millimeter button, but if you're using, I don't think you can get smaller, but if you're using bigger, then you might want to make these a bit bigger. You can use anything really, the elasticated one, but I really like the same fabric. So you just go ahead and cut 6 of these using all of the bits that you've created. You might have 1 long piece, but either way you just need to end up with 6 sections. So when you print out the pattern, you'll have this stitch guide. You can keep it, I've printed it on an A4 piece of paper, but I would cut roughly around it if you've printed it out on an A0 or if it's part of the A4 series. And it's easier to do this bit at the machine, but basically it just gives you a guide as to where to put these loops, and you're actually going to stitch on the paper down that line, and then we use this whole paper piece to put into the front bodice. So you'll find your rhythm of doing it. I just like to use a pin just to kind of keep it in place, and I've lined up that loop with the guide and I'm stitching on the stitch line. You want to make sure it stays in place, and then just as I go over that one, I'm going to get the next one ready. Lift up my presser foot, make sure it's evenly aligned. We really want these edges to be the same, and then make sure that it stays in place, and then I get the next one, and I just do that for the 6 loops. These ends, this side will be incorporating the seam allowance sandwiched between the lining and the bodice, so we're really looking for a straight line down here. And the paper just gives you stability. We tear it away at the next step. So now you have your loops ready to put into the front bodice. So on one side of the bodice you'll have the loops, and on the other side you have this little placket. This is just to provide some coverage because the bodice kind of goes quite low below the bust. So if the button and the loops pull apart, you don't see skin, you just see this placket. So we just need to, I've just pressed it along that fold, along the line there that it shows. You can cut this on the fold if you want to, or you can cut it and then fold it. I've just pressed it, and then on one of these short ends, you just want to put right sides together and stitch across the top at 1 centimetre. This is going to be at the top near the V that comes down, and then this raw edge will be incorporated when we join the skirt. And I like to just clip this corner so it's nice and sharp, and just turn that out. So we've got a nice clean point. And if you haven't pressed it before, give it a press. Mine's already done. And then I'll just choose which is the right and which is the wrong, depending on the type of fabric that you're using. So now we are ready with the loops that are going to go on one side and the placket that's going to go on the other side. So once you've stitched your loops on and you have the rough piece of paper, you can cut out that rectangle because this is going to give you your stitch line, your seam allowance. So you take the right side. I've got the right side of my bodice here, the outer bodice. I've also got my lining here. And flip it over so that you've got the right side to the right side, and you want to line up the bottom of the paper with the bottom of the bodice. So that's going to give you enough seam allowance here to join the skirt, and the top loop is going to sit just at the where you stitch down to that V. So that's the idea, that everything lines up. And I like to just pin it in place and then just do a quick stitch line, just a quick baste, so that when you're joining the lining, sandwiching this between the lining, you don't have to stress about it moving. So I'm going to use this stitch line as my guide, or even just a tiny bit on the inside of that, so that when I do stitch at 1 centimetre, I'm not going to see the lines. So I've just stitched that in place, just marginally inside the line that I used to stitch the loops on. And now I'm going to take my placket for the other side. So you've got the closed seam at the top, and you've got the raw edge here and the raw edge on the side. So the raw edge meets the bottom of the bodice and the side. Just pin that in place. And again, I would just do a quick, takes you a minute just to baste that. I like doing everything quickly, but I do figure this is worth taking the time, and just baste that in place. So I've got my loops basted, I've got my placket basted, and now it's time to add this lining and sandwich these between, so that when you turn it all out, it's like a really nice clean edge. So I've sewn the shoulder seams together, and we just put right sides together now for the front. Lay this out flat. And we're only stitching the V and the centre front. I'm not stitching the neck at this point because the collar does that job. So I just like to line that point up, find where it angles down. It's very subtle, so it's important to know where that is so that you can pivot the needle. Just pin that in place. You're stitching at a 1 centimetre seam allowance, so that's my point there that I'm going to pivot. And just make sure that you've got the edge of the lining, the edge of the paper and the edge of the outer all lined up here. And because you've basted at about 8 millimeters and you've stitched those loops on at 1 centimetre based on the stitching guide, you can stitch at 1 centimetre and you shouldn't see, well, you should be stitching exactly over the loop where you stitch the loop to the paper. If you want to make sure that you really don't see it, you just like a couple of mils in so that you don't see those stitch lines. You can always unpick them if you do see them. And to do the same for the other side. And you're going to be pivoting right at the top of that placket. Again, making sure that all those 3 layers are lined up. And now we're just going to stitch 1 centimetre, pivoting slightly and coming down here, and the same on this side. So now that you've sewn everything in place, we can remove this paper. And I haven't quite sewn far enough across, so I'll probably just unpick that stitch line there, which is fine. I can pull this one out too. And there you have your loops. And on the other side, there's the placket, all nice and neat. So now we just need to understitch. So it's a bit tricky if you've got the same fabric for the lining and the outer, but you want to make sure you know which one's the outer, and then you're understitching, making sure that the seam is going towards the lining. So you're going to understitch as close as you can to that seam line all the way up. And you're done. So I was always quite hesitant to do anything to do with button loops because I thought they were really hard, but I actually think it's easier than doing buttonholes myself. So then you will just join. I like to kind of just have a tiny bit of separation here. I don't mind seeing the placket. And then just position the buttons. I like to cover buttons for this, but you can use whatever you like. And then it's explained in the instructions, but you'll just kind of baste this area closed so that when you join the skirt, it's easier. So I hope that has been useful and that you are not worried about button loops like I was. because I think it's very doable. Thought I'd just show you how I make my self-covered buttons. So I've got 12mm buttons here, kind of like the size of them. I was finding them hard to reorder. I had some from a place called Jacobindi, and then I found some more from Oliver and May. So if you haven't done it before, you need these two tools, and then there's two parts to it. There's the bit that gets covered that you see, and then there's the kind of the back, which has got a shank. You can choose how you sew it on. I quite like these for this application. And then you just use your scrap fabric. There is a little circle guide thing, but I just find that a bit too time consuming. So I'm just looking at my top here. I feel like I kind of just want plain pink. There's a lot going on with these loops. So I'm just going to cut sections of the pink from my scrap fabric, and I tend to just cut a random kind of square that I know is going to fit roughly into this bit, and I just poke it in, and then you get you just sort of make sure it's even-ish, and then you get the rounded bit, the top, and you pop that in, press it in as far as you can, and then I found if you just kind of scrunch this up, make sure that it's all covered, and then if you just trim that off, then you just poke that in, making sure all the edges are covered. It looks like it's fiddly, but once you get into the zone, it's not too bad. And then the little sharp bit goes down, and the shank's on the outside. You put that in place, and you get the other little tool, and then you press that in to secure it all. Check that you've got all the edges covered, and then you pop it out, and you have a button. Very cute. Maybe I've missed that little bit there, but that's the idea, and then you repeat.